Hi guys, it's Andy McDonald, physio and strength and conditioning coach, and welcome to the Informed Performance podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by a returning guest of the show, Dr. Matt Jordan. Matt was with us for episode 21 back in March 2020, and he's a razor-sharp S&C coach, performance consultant, and also educator. In this episode, we will be discussing the force velocity curve and individualizing your considerations to the athlete in front of you. Then we'll also be discussing changing or optimizing movement patterns post-injury in quite a lot of depth. So a lot of great topics to sink your teeth into today. Matt, as you'll also hear in the episode, has a range of amazing courses that you can purchase and consume on his website, jordanstrength.com. And he has very kindly agreed to provide Informed Performance listeners of this episode 25% off of all of his educational courses until October 3rd. The code you'll need for this discount is InformPod2021, all in uppercase, so definitely check that out on his website, jordanstrength.com. This episode of the Informed Performance podcast has been sponsored by Vol Performance, makers of the Force Frame. Used by health and performance professionals for assessing and improving performance and rehabilitation, the Force Frame is a powerful solution for quickly and accurately testing isometric strength and imbalances. In addition to testing athletes, the Force Frame is also used to maintain and improve strength, offering over 130 isometric training protocols. As a portable and easy-to-use system, the Force Frame is designed to ensure every measurement can be accurately and reliably measured, time after time again. To learn more about the Force Frame, visit our sponsor, volperformance.com. Let's crack on with today's episode. You're listening to Informed Performance with me, Andy McDonald, and here is today's episode with Dr. Matt Jordan. Matt Jordan, welcome back to Informed Performance, mate.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. Good to be here.
No, it's good to get you back on and good to catch up. So you were, of course, on the show with me for episode 21 in March 2020, I think, which feels longer ago than it was. But for good measure, can you fill our listeners in on your background through to maybe your current day job, just in case this is someone's kind of first encounter of you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In a nutshell, I moved to the Olympic Training Center here in Calgary many moons ago. I was really fortunate to have been sort of mentored and obviously got to know personally Charles Poliquin, who kind of exposed me to the career path that I took. And obviously passed away a few years ago, but Charles was a big influence in my life that kind of got me pointed in a direction. And long story short, as I spent the next 15, 20 years as a sport physiologist and strength and conditioning coach working with several of Canada's Olympic teams. It was an amazing career, working a lot with winter sport, but across a range of sports for sure: American football, mixed martial arts, boxing, snowboarding, all kinds of sports. The main thing that sort of sparked a career change for me was after the Vancouver Olympics, honestly, just needing a change in my life. I think a lot of coaches and practitioners get to that stage where they're, they just are looking for a pivot. And that was exactly the case for me. At that point, it had been my fourth Olympic cycle, and I was just needing to sort of reevaluate my life. And I got put back with alpine ski racing, and the athletes, anybody who's involved with ski racing will know that the prevalence of ACL injury is just, it's like every other athlete seems to have an ACL injury at some point. And I had always wanted to go back and get the PhD done, which I did. And I did a PhD in medical science, which the focus was trying to develop better tests, better capacity to forecast recovery after ACL injury, and obviously better rehab and training that helps injured athletes at large, but more specifically at the time was elite alpine ski racers, helping bridge the gap between their injury and getting back to their pre-injury performance level. So, I kind of say it's like we're bridging the gap between sport performance and sport medicine, and trying to put the performance into rehab and really helping athletes over the long term get back to where they were. So that's kind of the journey. As I went from sport physiologist and strength and conditioning coach to PhD medical science to now where I sit today, which is I head up sports science at the Canadian Sports Institute Calgary, which is one of the Olympic training centers in Canada. I'm an assistant professor in kinesiology at U of C, and still doing lots of consulting and online education and work in the area around the fields of sport performance and bridging the gap with rehab and injury.
Cool. Very good mixed bag that I've no doubt keeps you incredibly busy.
Yeah, absolutely.
For the listeners' benefit, I've completed your online education, and I've genuinely got an enormous amount out of it, both from a physio perspective and a strength and conditioning perspective. And a lot of today's conversation is going to be me cherry picking some of the topics that I enjoyed reading about from your courses. And firstly, the information is just excellent, and I think the way you've formatted and organized the content for the learner, or for me in this situation, for my ability to just kind of work through at my own pace, I thought was brilliant. And firstly, just as inspired how we at Informed Performance are now going to set up our educational platform, stealing your ideas. But let's firstly just talk about what education you provide, and for context, for the topics that you have, why did you choose them? And I guess contextually, why do they matter?
Yeah, no, I mean, really appreciate that little segue there. I sometimes feel fortunate that my journey in high performance sport, like in the realm of Olympic sport, I mean, I'm not the only person, so I'm not trying to say like I'm the only one who's benefited of this, but I sort of feel like I got classically trained in the world of training methodology and periodization, sports science, sport physiology, in the sense that many of my mentors along the way were just highly embedded in for decades in the world of elite sport, elite training. And I think when you're working in Olympic sport, what I always find is nice is that you get these athletes for long periods of time. So you get them, when they're kind of 16, 17 oftentimes, and they, you might have them under your wing for 15 years or more as they sort of transcend their careers. And with all of those sort of opportunities that present themselves, one of the things that's absolutely clear is you can really start to now take a longitudinal approach to looking at sport performance and adaptation to training. And you can start to take a scientific approach in the sense that you can employ a lot of the knowledge that you would read in textbooks, and you can actually use it on a day-to-day basis to really help these athletes find those, small margins that they need to perform. And so when I was putting the course together, it was really kind of that in mind, I guess, as a fundamental overarching goal. And the other thing that was an overarching goal was the recognition that, for someone like myself, as a strength and conditioning coach and sport physiologist, I would find that I would be working with athletes who were injured. And, the physicians and the surgeons had their metrics that they were looking at to gauge readiness for getting back to sport. The physiotherapists would have theirs. And then the conversation would come to us, and it would say, they would be like, all right, so, now this athlete might be, let's say an ACL injury. They're, maybe 10 months post-surgery, and they're kind of getting back onto more of a high level of competition. And, they would be looking at us to say, okay, like, are they ready to go? And what I found was a lot of my friends and colleagues, they would test them, their strength is good. They might do them, put them through some speed tests or whatever, all performance-based. And which is fine, but they would be missing this link about really how to understand the problem that exists for those athletes. Namely, that very often after sport injury, the rehabilitation is just a small part of the puzzle. If you're talking about getting an athlete back to performance, it's often measured in many, many months, if not years. And really, at the end of the day, it's kind of like taking your car to the dealership and having them sort of hook up your, when you have an engine issue, they hook up the computers to figure out what's going on so they can diagnose where the issue is. In a very similar way, we just didn't have those tools. And so that's the second part of the course, which is how do I help, how do I help bridge the gap between the sport performance world and the more clinical sport medicine world, not from the standpoint of trying to train, sport performance people and make them clinicians. I'm talking about allowing them to speak the language a bit more, and then to develop their own acumen and their own ways of being able to add to the puzzle of helping athletes get back after injury. So with all that said, the first course is a real deep dive into the science of muscle strength and power. I call it first principles, but you go back to first principles of physiology, biomechanics. I think they're essential, fundamental knowledge bases for people like ourselves. We try to always connect it back to the real world. We spend a big chunk of time looking at movement assessments and where they fit. And then we get into neuromuscular testing. And one of the techniques, obviously, that has become more commonplace is the use of a dual force plate system to evaluate kinetic asymmetry. So we spend a lot of time on that. Course 2 is a deep dive into program design. So what I'm trying to do is take all the science and all the testing and all the assessment techniques that we talk about in course 1, and then really converting it into some tangible outcomes for how you can design programs, including energy systems and looking at periodization and a big chunk around return to performance after injury. We have a full course on eccentric training and sort of assessing eccentric strength capacity, just because that's often a specific niche area that we're interested in attending to. And then, the final part is how strength and conditioning coaches, sport performance practitioners, sport medicine practitioners can think more like a scientist. And so we have a final kind of course where it's about, using, I call it like white belt skills in the programming language called R. Not there to try and make you a code ninja. I'm just trying to, teaching somebody who's never coded in their life, like you don't even understand what the heck this is, and then how to work with data, how to understand sort of data structure, data cleaning, all those pieces of the puzzle, but using that programming language R to streamline processes. So I'm sure people who are really expert in R would probably provide criticism to my approach, but it's really meant to be like, you've never done this. How would my brain approach learning this in a really basic way? So you get those skills, and then you can launch yourself into the world of becoming a bit more data driven and a bit more independent along that journey. So there you go. That's the courses, and that's where it all came from.
I think with what you're saying about your R course as well, I feel like even if your goal isn't to be really competent at coding, just some level of introduction to what coding can do and what it looks like, I think can be useful, just because then you know what you may need or who you can find that can do it for you if you're not going to pursue it yourself in a performance environment.
Agreed. I mean, I can remember, so my master's is in neuromuscular physiology. Exercise physiology was the sort of domain that I was in, and in my master's thesis, the question that we were looking at was looking at the acute effects of whole body vibration on basically on various properties of the neuromuscular system. So we were using nerve stimulation and looking at the interpolated twitch technique and voluntary muscle activation and some other measures, EMG and whatnot. At the time, I can recall sitting down after having collected all my data and literally hand bombing, hundreds of files where I would go through and find peaks and, find averages over time frames. And it would be like writing them down pen to paper and then inputting this into Excel and making sure I didn't make any mistakes and all that stuff. And then, a long time passed. And, at that time, not to date myself, but coding was just, I'd never even thought about that. And I can say it was probably about 2011, a guy named Jonathan Tremblay. He's a professor at University of Montreal. And I was actually in CEP in Paris, France. We were doing some presentations, and I looked over at Jonathan's computer. He was wrapping up his PhD, and I was like, "Jonathan, your computer's broken. What is all that stuff? Have you been hacked by a virus?" And he's like, "No, this is R." And I was like, "What? Like our or no?" He's like, "The letter R." And I said, "What is that? Like, what are you doing?" And he's like, "Oh, let me show you." And he he showed me at the time he was using ggplots to generate these really nice figures for his PhD, and I was like, oh my God, it's amazing. And he's like, oh yeah, you just code it, and he's like, the learning curve is is definitely slow. Like you're not gonna, you got to kind of get over the hump, but once you're there, he's just sort of showing me the power of it. And my God, is that ever like a turning point in one's career when you literally get, as I say, like, even if it's just kind of yellow belt, green belt skills in coding where you can kind of do your own thing. Oh my Lord, does that ever just open up the doors to be able to work with your data, tell stories with your data, generate visuals and stuff that your targets, whether they be athletes or coaches, they can work with. And I totally agree. You don't have to be coding ninja. You just need to know enough to kind of get by, and you need to know enough to know when you can ask someone for help to help streamline your processes and make your workflows more efficient. And that is just essential in my world in terms of today's skill sets for people working in high performance sport.
Yeah, no doubt. I want to kind of cherry pick, if I may, force velocity first as one of the big topics that you cover amongst your courses. And I think this is something that people can easily now skim over the theory with because of how convenient different devices like velocity-based training devices can be, and their sort of their visuals for how you display the information. But I think in your content, there's a lot of detail on the force velocity curve and how we may want to move it, say, upwards or outwards through specific training.
Yeah.
But in the first instance, how, when you're working with an athlete, how do you identify and assess maybe the ideal slope or curve for a certain individual? And the reason I say this is because, a tractor and an Audi, as you describe as an analogy, may have the same output, but have a different task design.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, it's such a hot topic, and I think it's such a useful assessment technique. But I do have some comments that just to tee this up. And, I was one of my mentors and the guy that I studied under for many years, a guy named Dr. Walter Herzog, who's a bit of a legend when it comes to biomechanics. Now his research these days is more, past, 25, 30 years has been more fundamental, looking at the mechanics of how muscles work and really trying to understand muscle contraction. So he's sort of subcellular tissue mechanics, which is, a mouthful to say at the very least. But Walter, his original background was as a track and field coach. And so he is just keenly interested in everything related to sport performance. And he's keenly interested in the types of research interests that I've got. And so we always had some amazing conversations around this. And the first thing to mention that I think is so crucial is a force velocity relationship depends on how you measure it. And that's a key thing that I think listeners need to understand, is that there is this basic muscle property, the force velocity relationship, that explains, and it goes back, to the 1930s. It explains the properties of muscle during a concentric muscle action, whereby as the velocity of muscle action increases, the force generating capacity decreases in a maximally activated muscle at a constant length, which are two other really important parts of the puzzle to say, and I'll link this back to testing in a second. But that notion that it depends on how you measure it, and that it is a maximally activated muscle at a constant length, these are important things, because this then starts to shape the types of force velocity relationships that you may measure by virtue of the testing that you're doing. Now you expand out to our world where we're looking at elite sport, and in the course, I talk a lot about this from kind of some fundamental notions, right? So this idea of intercepts and slope, but really what I would encourage anybody listening who's interested in this to do is remember that how you do this depends on how you measure it. And what you want to make sure is that for your situation that you are in, that you develop a robust methodology where you can understand the error and you can understand what you're obtaining, and then understand the relationship with performance. And so to that end, in the course, I talk a little bit more, I kind of move away from a force velocity profile to the term, I call it sometimes a functional force velocity relationship. And by functional, I mean just some sort of task. Obviously in the course, I talk a lot about jumping, but using some sort of task with various loading conditions where you can sort of create what the relationship is between some sort of velocity measure and then change in loading conditions. So in this case, when we develop this in the course, what you'll see is the dependent variable. So what we're measuring is the takeoff velocity in jumping, which we are able to obtain a relatively good, like we just sort of by virtue of the types of stuff that we do in our lab, we know it's a relatively stable measure. It's got good reliability. What we put on as our independent variable, so the variable that we're changing is the loading condition, and in this case we're talking about the load on a trap bar jump squat. And really, at the end of the day, not to kind of undercut the question, but yes, we get slope. Yes, we get intercepts. The intercepts, are obviously because of the way we're measuring this stuff. There can be a lot of variability in them. But what I would say is, once you've done this and you've measured well, how you extract variables to help sort of create frameworks of monitoring can be extremely nuanced. Like you can use these the way you need to accomplish the goals given the environment you're in. And I'll just give you one example of this. Formerly working with one of our strength and conditioning coaches at the Sport Institute, a guy named Graham Chalice. But we had a problem with our bobsledders where we didn't have really good sort of off-ice predictors of bobsleigh push performance, where they would go in and sort of push the sled. When we did these measurements, the thing that we could extract from the functional force velocity relationship, as described before, would be, I use this example in the course, is we looked at a loading condition that was similar to the types of loads that they would use when they're pushing a bobsleigh. So in this case, it's about 133 kilo external load. And we extrapolated using the linearity of that relationship to actually predict what the takeoff velocity would have been with 133 kilos had they jumped with it. And, that's an example of, you're not going to read in any textbook. That's not looking at a slope. That's not looking at an intercept. That's looking at something very specific to the context I'm in. But, if you do good measurements and you kind of realize that how you do this sort of depends on your context, what you obtain depends on how you measure it. Gosh, there's a whole bunch of flexibility there for practitioners to really, create their own knowledge and their own measurements of force velocity relationships in a functional way to help drive their understanding of human performance and adaptation to training.
And, we can create arbitrary thresholds or objectives and the standards for what we want to see on the graph. And I get why that's useful. I think, simplistically, we maybe have moved away from this idea that more force or velocity is always advantageous to somebody. Yeah. But of course, there's scenarios where we don't always want to layer on, say, more output to the system, perhaps if technique is suboptimal or falls outside an ideal symmetry index. How do you personally navigate cross-comparing the kinematics or the movement technique as the sort of movement piece against kinetics and output? And I'm asking you this because I think the quality of the underpinning kinetics is important to know as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think probably the best example here that I can take that can help really delineate the importance of having, I always say it's like we're not coaching a spreadsheet, we're not training a spreadsheet, we're training a real live human being, right? So it works both ways. It works both in the sense that we realize that measurement can't solve all our problems. And on the other hand, if you're not measuring, you're likely to overlook or overestimate the impact that you're really having on the athlete and their adaptation to the medicine you prescribe them, which is your training programs, right? I mean, that's what you do and I do and everybody else does is you sit down, you put pen to paper, you write a program, and your hypothesis is, your hunch is, if I give you this, it's going to make you better in specific ways. That's kind of a key tenet of the types of work that we do. And I think in the case of injury, this is an example where you need to kind of holistically view the athlete from the idea, exactly like you said, how they move, the kinetics, and I'll say simply like how they're applying force and absorbing energy and whatnot as they move about, and having ways example of being a functional force velocity profile where you can really characterize basic muscle properties, basic functional properties of the neuromuscular system to track adaptation over time. So back to the injured athlete, I'll give you an example. It's a case study example that we talk about in the course. In this case, it's an athlete who suffers a horrendous knee injury. I mean, essentially a full knee dislocation. And what we talk about is at that. So as the athlete is coming along through their rehabilitation, and I'm not talking rehab and measured in a matter of months. We're talking, 2 years to get back to sport. Really, is what this. It took a year just to get, sort of some level of normal day-to-day functional capacity back. But shortly thereafter, I mean, the athlete's healing capacity and their physical fitness capacities are just massively impressive. I mean, the athlete actually hits a personal record in the personal best in power clean. Shortly after, a few mesocycles of training, he's just doing unbelievably well, right? This is great. Now, the naive strength coach might say, "Well, that's great. I mean, you just hit a new personal best in a power clean. I think you're going to be ready to go here sooner than we think. Like, we might actually be able to accelerate your return to sport because you're obviously doing so well in the gym." However, when you really break down his movement patterns, when you really break down his strength capacities, what was absolutely clear was, despite the fact that he was able to hit a personal best in the power clean, that when we watched how he moved and we measured the kinetics, in this case, using our functional force velocity test, which was essentially measuring the takeoff velocity as our dependent variable. So basically takeoff velocity and jumping across 3 loading conditions. It was absolutely clear that this individual was lacking eccentric strength capacity and sort of more generally movement control through phases of movements when he was putting on the brakes. So what this appeared as was elevated kinetic asymmetries, especially with greater loads, only in the eccentric deceleration phase of a counter movement jump. We were also able to tie this back with high-speed video and other kinematic measurements to clearly show that when he was in those phases of movement, that his general control of that movement, you could observe visually that there were deficits that needed to be addressed. And why this is so important and why I think, your question matters so much is that it's a really good example of taking a basic muscle property, i.e. the force-velocity relationship, which we've known about since the 1930s after A.V. Hill's seminal studies and work, expanding it into modern day strength and power labs like many institutions have and professional teams have, and developing good tests. So in this case, doing counter movement jumps with no external load, 30% of external load, or 30% of body mass and 60% of body mass added as external load. Breaking down the jump, not only just looking at how high did you jump, but actually looking at the kinetics. So now looking at the force signature of the individual in phases of movement that matter, i.e. how he unloads, how he puts on the brakes, and how he pushes into the ground to get himself up and off the plates. And then really using the clues that are sitting in front of you to drive decision-making. So yes, his power clean is great, but when you break down the kinetics, the kinematics, and you look at these fundamental, I would just say fundamental muscle properties, but at the whole body level, it's like, holy geez, we're really missing stuff here. And I'll add one more kind of flavor to the question is that now that you know what matters in the sense that you've measured something and you can clearly see where the deficits exist, you can actually target your training to be able to address those deficits. And why this matters so much is that I can recall the first program we designed to help kind of bridge this gap. The individual went back and trained in their hometown for a period of about 4 to 5 weeks. As a strength and conditioning coach, my bias would be that I'm an amazing strength and conditioning coach. And of course, my programs are absolutely bulletproof. And if I give you this program, you're going to do nothing but improve and become, amazing at the things I'm trying to train. But if you're not measuring it, you can't change it. lo and behold, the individual comes back after their first training block on my magical program, and they have gotten worse. They are actually worse at the things that were previously identified as gaps. And the reason that they were worse is that they were training on top of bad movement patterns. So in this case, this individual was training to maximize the load on the bar, not training to maximize the movement competencies that we were trying to work on. So there's a difference there, right? If I'm trying to lift to maximize the amount of load I have on the bar, that may be a different movement competency than if I'm trying to train to ensure that I'm changing a deficit that I've observed in an eccentric deceleration phase that may relate to my overall development as I get back to sport. And so it was not the case that the athlete came back after 6 weeks with magical improvement. In fact, it was the opposite. They'd regressed even more, which was another clue, hey, okay, what are we missing? Well, what we're missing is you're training with the wrong intention. And this is where I think your point was so brilliant at the beginning there, Andrew. The question is that we're not always training just to improve the capacity, right? Because if he's trying to improve the capacity, well, he should just keep going the way he's going. But that's not what we were trying to change. We were trying to change his eccentric deceleration ability, both in terms of the kinematics and the kinetics. And that requires a different intention, a different purpose in training, a different focus for him. And it was not until that next block that we were able to address it and bridge the gap and move him forward in the appropriate direction to help kind of support him as he made a transition back to sport. So, yeah, I think it's a great example. Well, it's a great question, but I think that is when you talk about injury, it's a great example where for your listeners, you can employ kind of a broad approach to this, be Sherlock Holmes, try to figure out the problem, and then, design programs that are going to change the things that matter, and just don't expect that your programs are always going to work. So this is a great kind of accountability, when you're doing this in a monitoring framework, it's a great way to kind of ensure that you're moving the needle in the right direction.
Yeah, it's a good amount of detail and a very good summary there. When you test and collect data on athletes, we often have to kind of follow a strict logistical plan, especially in team sports, to keep things or groups to keep things on a schedule and get athletes, on and off the rack or on and off the force plates in a timely manner. How much kind of opportunity do you have, or how much kind of stock do you place in having the opportunity to question athletes? And what I mean by this is, you can see something on the screen that sits as an outlier in the data, even if you just spot it quickly visually. But we may sometimes, the way things get structured logistically, miss the kind of human factor, like the athlete's technique belief or reasoning for why they move like that, or I don't know, maybe they're in pain. How, is that something that you factor in, I don't know, maybe time-wise or when you are testing?
Oh yeah, I mean, I factor it in not just. I think it's so essential for us to realize that, it's not just time and it's not just on that day, but if you don't have trust and buy-in from the athlete, all bets are off. And I'll be honest with you, I think that sometimes, all the testing that we do can be overwhelming, and it can be too much, especially if you don't have that foundation of trust. So not only is it sort of like carving off time where you can appropriately have the conversations and dive into things, but you have to take stock before you even do that to say, do I have somebody on the other side of the table here who actually trusts me and actually wants to hear what I have to say? And, I bring that up only because I don't think it matters how much you know. It doesn't matter what your credentials are. Athletes need to first buy into you and your processes in order for them to sort of be open to the types of things that, we're suggesting here. I would 100% agree that, when you have routine monitoring and an athlete's about to go kick off a training session and you measure something that doesn't seem quite right, I always pause and I ask the question is this real? Did I actually measure something that's a stable movement pattern here, or a stable measurement of something that if I was to do it again and again and again would be there and would not change? And the reason I think that's so important is sometimes it's easy to see one test and to start getting very granular and making decisions around what what should or shouldn't be done. And that, I just don't think that's the way to go. So number one is, if you measure something and it seems outside of the norm, push the pause button, ask yourself, and again, it's the curious coach who pays attention, right? That's my Dan Paff quote. The curious coach who pays attention. What could be driving what I just saw there? Is it a one-off? Is the athlete, is there something else going on? There are all sorts of things that might be at play. If you come in again, and let's say you make another measurement, and now you say, oh, there it is again. Okay. Is it bad? Is it associated with injury? Is it associated with apprehension? Is it associated with something else that's going on? That's another important reflection point before anything is said to the athlete about what might be happening. And then I think the third step in the third point, which is really where your question picks up, is, okay, now you're going to do something about this. What's the strategy? And I am a firm believer that if I have the level of trust that, I need in order to have these conversations, I like nothing better than to carve off some time and to make a training session in the strength and power lab. So we'll go in, we'll be like, all right, let's do your power cleans on the dual force plate system. Let's do some trap bar jump squats. Let's work on some of your lifts in the gym. Let's see what's going on. And then let's use the measurement as an educational tool to back up what we're feeling and what we're observing. And I think on that level, I think it requires a bit of time, and I like nothing better than to find that time, but to make it purposeful, not when the athlete's feeling, like they're under the gun or being measured or being evaluated, that we're doing it now in a collaborative way, sort of some shared purpose, shared decision-making. This isn't me trying to judge them and to, find things that might hold them back. It's about me trying to optimize my program and optimize what I'm going to give them to do, and to have them understand where the focal points need to be. And I think at the end of the day, that's, those are some of my favorite days. I love doing that. And I love doing that, especially when I've got a willing sport medicine practitioner, like a physiotherapist or an osteopath or somebody who's working with me from their angle. And then, man, it's magic. Like you got the athlete, you got the strength coach, you got the clinician. We're all coming from our perspectives, and we're problem solving, and we're using data to keep ourselves honest in the moment. I think it's massive. And it really does help us get better context and better opportunities for conversation. Like you said, what could be driving things? There's so many layers and factors here. And whether it's pain, injury, all those things, like they're doing it because that's how they think they should be doing it. We need to have those conversations with the notion of, shared decision making and sort of working together to solve problems in mind.
And I think this is probably a good segue. Our audience is very mixed, especially between physios and strength and conditioning coaches. And to preface this next point or topic, I hope people are leaning on me as the host as I state a bit of an observation in practice, as I'm a physio and a coach, so I'm not taking a stance either way. But as stereotypes in the rehab process, S&C coaches can sometimes be focused on habitually cueing or picking mechanical solutions for changing a movement pattern post-injury, versus, more traditional physios may be over-focused occasionally on pain and influencing sensory input to change movement patterns post-injury. And I don't think either's necessarily right or wrong. And there's good examples of both professions where people are inclusive of broader considerations. But I think your program design course does a far nicer job than I can do explaining this under your common internal constraints section. Would you be happy to talk through this, or your consideration and strategies for improving movement competencies or patterns post injury?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think in the course, I use Newell's model, sort of that constraints led approach to movement, and only because I think it's a framework that can help. I should really think it can help practitioners understand a little, like zooming out to 30,000 feet. If you are focused on, as a clinician, focused on the clinical pieces that are important to you, and I think sometimes about like what I've learned from my surgeon friends, big part of, sort of going into this transition and, when I was doing my PhD in medical science was spending, I don't know how many days, lots of days up in the OR with a surgeon that was on my committee and just, watching him do surgeries and just trying to understand, like, where are you coming from? Like, what are you seeing? And he'd go in and he'd scope and he'd look and he'd tell me about, the anatomy and how the surgery was going and the graft size. And, these would be concerns I would have for this person doing this coming back. And here's the problems I see and I face. And I'll be honest with you, like when you start to see this, you start to realize that, what we often identify with is our role and the badge that we wear. So if you're a clinician, you're seeing things that absolutely do matter. It's just not an exclusive list of the only things that matter. And likewise with a strength coach, it's not that the cueing mechanical side, those matter too. It's just FYI for the strength coach, it's just not an exclusive list. There are other things and there are other considerations that if we took a moment to be sort of, oh, I see where you're coming from. I get it now. I see why you might ask me not to do these certain movements at this phase in the rehabilitation, because you're looking at these sort of tissue healing considerations or this pain cycle or this thing that's happening. And I think where I've tried to sort of help practitioners kind of grasp that is with the Newell's model. So in Newell's model, it's this notion that, you've got movement strategies that are shaped by various constraints. And, there's internal constraints, there's task constraints and environmental constraints. There's sort of perception and action of the individual as they're, working through their world. And obviously all these things work together in terms of what ends up displaying as the dominant movement strategy. And anybody who's ever worked with, someone with chronic low back pain or someone who's been scared of coming back from sport after an injury and they've changed how they've moved, you'll know that sometimes these movement patterns that emerge can be problematic and they can get in the way of sport performance. And so with the notion of Newell's model, where we're looking at internal constraints, I'm trying to help the individuals involved to switch from being I'm a strength coach, this is what I do, this is how I see these problems. I hand off to the physiotherapist or whatever to let them do their thing where they go and solve problems, to this idea of being Sherlock Holmes together. How do you work together to understand each other's point of view? And how do you work together in order to make sense of the potential factors that may be contributing to what you see? So starting point number one to your question is, I actually did this presentation for Brett Bartholomew in a course that he had a sort of an online event that he did about 5 or 6 months ago. But I said the title of the course of the presentation was along the lines of, I think I was a better leader when I was in kindergarten because I knew how to follow. And the notion here is that when you're working in an environment with other professionals who have different points of view, you got to know when to follow and you got to know when to lead. And the first starting point here is, back to changing these sort of stubborn movement strategies that may emerge after injury is, how do I lead in my space, but also display strong followership skills to my team? So if I'm working with a clinician who's got a perspective on whether it was the injury, the secondary injuries that were suffered, the pain cycle, whatever it might be, I've got to display very strong followership skills to them to show them that I'm allowing them to take the lead on the domains of their expertise, or their domains and areas of expertise. And on the flip side, I need to display my leadership when it comes to the things that, maybe are within my areas of expertise. And that to me is crucial, right? So you've got to have a strong team, and you've got to have a team that can work together, and you've got to have a team that can send and share signals about who's leading, who's following, and how do we work together as a team. That 9 times out of 10 is where things break down to trying to change a stubborn movement strategy, is that people are working in isolation. They're doing their own thing. We've got people doubling up on the same strategies or sometimes conflicting with each other because they're not talking and they're not working together in a team-oriented way to help the target athlete involved. So that's number one. Number two is I really do like to take a comprehensive look at this idea of potential internal constraints. Like what could be shaping the movement strategy here? Fear, pain, range of motion. Like think about individuals who we've seen this several times now. We want to do a little paper on it, but individuals who develop a cyclops lesion and sort of are at that stage where it's slightly unclear whether they do or they don't have the issue. Surgeons reluctant to go back in. Very often we'll measure stuff in the strength and power lab that will be sort of like elevated asymmetries in certain phases of the jump. Sort of this inability or unwillingness to really extend the knee joint, terminal range, muscle activation issues. But all of these things, as an example, back to the question is, if we're able to have a broad view and we're able to sort of understand where each other is coming from, and we can speak each other's language a little bit better, we can start to develop, theories, strategies, and ideas on what we want to do in a cohesive way to change and modify a movement strategy that might be considered to be problematic. And so, from there, I think that's where I think the Newell's model helps, right? Because it kind of gets you out of your own lane a little bit and starts to let you see, okay, right? Like all of these things work together. The pain cycle is important. Range of motion is important. Strength at the joint is important. What's happening with swelling and tissue health is important. But equally, what's happening above and below the joint are also important, including things that might be a little bit distal from the area the area that's having the issue. Again, if we can kind of lay that foundation with a good team and we can start to sort of speak the same language, I think that's honestly the best way to get after it. So I know that wasn't necessarily like the nuts and bolts of it in terms of my strategy, in terms of like what I would, how I might actually approach it. But that to me are really a few cornerstones of making this happen, because we get tied up in our own heads and in our own roles, and we stop talking to each other, and it becomes almost impossible to develop a coherent strategy on how to tackle these complex challenges, like an athlete with a movement strategy that we're trying to influence, and it's just stubborn and we're not having much success. Yeah.
No, I thought you did a brilliant job giving that overview then, because there's a lot of nuggets in there, but I didn't give you a overly specific context. I just sort of forced you to vibe with that one a little bit. But Matt, I really thank you for your time. I think across this episode, you've done an excellent job of hitting some basic sciences, some practical testing considerations, and then also looping in and balancing it with sort of human factors. So I know you're a busy man, and I really do thank you for your time and your contribution today in the episode.
Oh, hey, no, thanks very much. Great to be here and have a chance to chat. I'm just equally appreciative of you giving me a second opportunity to have a conversation. So thank you.
I know you've got obviously a busy day job and you consult, but you do have courses. What have you got going on or coming out? And where can people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the courses, you can go to my website, www.jordanstrength.com. The courses can all be found there. You can buy the 4 courses individually, or you can buy the all courses together in what's called the GSC EP system. So it's kind of bringing everything together. You save a bit of money if you do that. But what I would say, like I try to keep free content on my site, free resources, and we do twice a year. We do a course launch where the prices come down. It's sort of you get some other sort of, I would just say, sort of more exclusive offers with that time of year. So if your listeners are interested, the next course launch will be in December, and we usually do one in December and one in sort of June, July-ish. And they should just come stay tuned on my social media channels. My handle is @JordanStrength. Go to my website, check out the courses, sign up to my newsletter. That way you're staying sort of abreast of what's going on. But today, if you wanted to go buy the courses, they are available. You can pop on my site and, they're all there and you can learn about them. And of course, if anyone has questions, always do my best to give you a personal response to, if you have got questions or things you want to chat about. So feel free to email me or reach out over my social media and we can talk about your questions as it pertains to courses or anything else that we're offering.
Cool. And we'll put links to your website and your social media handles in the episode description and also in the show notes for today's episode. So, no, that's brilliant, mate. And I do thank you for coming back on. And there's endless topics I could probably try and drag you back for and pick your brains on for people's benefit.
Amazing. I'm happy to do it. So yeah, let's put that in the books.
Cool. Perfect. Thanks, mate. Big thanks to Dr. Matt Jordan for coming back on the show. Don't forget, if you're interested in his online courses, then use our Inform Performance 25% discount code when you purchase them. Simply type in InformPod 2021 as an uppercase code to apply the discount on the price. Speaking of education, head to informperformance.com where, as usual, you can find our articles, episodes, and our show notes, but topically our own educational courses and webinars too. We will have some great webinars and courses coming out consistently, starting with the Sporting Hand and Wrist with Ian Gatt. Additionally, if you want to hear about these updates in real time, then find us and follow us on Instagram at Inform Performance or on Twitter at InformPod. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Inform Performance podcast with me, Andy McDonald, and catch us next time for more performance and sports medicine insights.